Welcome back to Fair and Square Files, where we dissect the most intriguing legal cases with a sharp eye for detail and commitment to uncovering the truth. I'm your host, Lulu Bell. Thank you so much for returning. This is the second podcast that we have done on our deep dive into the Karen Read case. Now, the podcasts are really handy, actually, because we can express our opinions, we can go into a few other details without continuously stopping and interfering with the testimony as it's coming to hand live. So, yeah, this is a really good way to balance it out and also give our opinion on certain issues that have just come up regarding the case. As I mentioned, this is the second podcast, so if you are unfamiliar with the ongoings of the trial so far or the case as a whole, I'd suggest that maybe you start back at the first podcast, get a better understanding of where we're at currently. As the trial pushes forward, we're starting to explore another option, the option that maybe it's an accident rather than an intentional homicide. We'll also be touching base on the complexities of a potential cover-up if there was one at play. So let's kick straight into it. I thought today we might just break it down into a few different segments, just a few questions that have been going round in my head anyway, and maybe some of yours. Let's start with Karen Read's own words. During the investigation, Read repeatedly asked, "Did I hit him? And could I have hit him?" These questions have sparked significant debate. Are they a sign of guilt or simply the utterances of a hysterical woman overwhelmed by the shock of finding her partner, JohnOKeefe, injured in the snow? Now, let's consider her state of mind, sleep-deprived, possibly still under the influence of alcohol, and facing a traumatic scene. It's crucial to differentiate between "I hit him" and "did I hit him." That slight difference could be monumental when it comes to the jury's interpretation of the words. The defense team has made concerted efforts to cast doubt on the expert testimony from the first responders and the eyewitnesses, who claimed to have heard Karen ask, "Did I hit him?" or "Could I have hit him?" in the early hours of that morning. Now, they do this by meticulously dissecting the nuances of these testimonies. The defense has attempted to highlight potential inconsistencies and the context in which these statements were made. One of the key strategies employed by the defense is to underscore the highly stressful and chaotic circumstances surrounding the incident. They argue that Karen's utterances made in a state of distress and confusion could easily be misinterpreted. The defense has also pointed out that such questions may reflect a panicked response rather than an admission of guilt, suggesting that they should be seen in the light of someone trying to make sense of a shocking situation, unexpected in every way. Furthermore, the defense has questioned the reliability of eyewitness testimonies, pointing to the possibility of confirmation bias and the fallibility of human memory. Particularly under traumatic conditions, they have sought to demonstrate that the testimonies of the first responders and other witnesses might have been influenced by the chaotic environment and the preconceived notions about the incident. While the defense's efforts to cast doubt are comprehensive and strategically sound, the ultimate impact on the jury remains uncertain. The defense has certainly raised critical questions about the interpretation of Karen's statements, but whether these efforts are sufficient to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors will depend on how convincingly these points were argued and perceived within the broader context of the trial's evidence. In conclusion, the defense has endeavored to challenge the expert testimonies effectively, but the success of these efforts in casting significant doubt is contingent upon the jurors' interpretation and the overall narrative presented during the trial. If we delve into the myriad of inconsistencies and coincidences that have plagued this case, several witnesses reported unexplained phone messages or missed calls, often described as butt dials, on the evening of O'Keefe's death. Brian Albert allegedly butt dialed Brian Higgins, who then returned the call with another supposed butt dial. This alone raises eyebrows, but the pattern doesn't stop there. I should also point out that occurred in the early hours of that fateful morning. Brian Albert and Brian Higgins both acquired new phones mere days before receiving a formal order mandating the preservation of their devices and forbidding their disposal. Notably, Brian Higgins went to the extraordinary lengths of consulting a technical expert, his friend by the way, on how to selectively remove specific messages before turning over his phone. This approach appears considerably more complex and laborious than simply handing over the phone as it was. One might question why Higgins did not take the straightforward route unless he had other incriminating evidence to conceal. The subsequent actions taken by Higgins, including the disposal of his phone and the destruction of its SIM card at the local army base without first removing the images or the contact information, even family, significantly heightened suspicions. Such measures suggest a deliberate effort to control the information or the investigation's process. While it is plausible that the phone contained other sensitive material unrelated to the case, Higgins could have disclosed the presence of such confidential information to the authorities. Now, typically any sensitive or classified material would remain protected and confidential under legal safeguards. Therefore, the extraordinary steps taken by Higgins imply a desire to obscure potentially incriminating evidence, casting further doubt on his actions and intentions. Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert's sister-in-law, has several unexplained calls to the victim around the time of his arrival to the house. More suspiciously, she conducted a search on her phone for how long to die in the snow. Now, she misspells it. She actually spells how's long to die in the snow. This is after 2 a.m. It was also deleted. On record, it's showing as being deleted. Now, she adamantly denies this. However, it is recorded in the phone records. While this could be dismissed as a mere technical glitch, the timing and nature of the search suggest otherwise. Colin Albert, Brian Albert's nephew, also has a suspicious gap in his incoming messages after the event. This series of deleted or unexplained calls and messages paints a picture of potential concealment. Could it be that the Alberts and their family or friends discovered O'Keefe injured in the snow and chose not to act, fearing implication in the crime? I mean, it's a possibility, isn't it? These coincidences and actions, while very suspicious, might also be totally unrelated. Events compounded by stress and fear. It's essential to consider both possibilities, a coordinated cover-up or a series of unfortunate, albeit suspicious, mishaps. Let's also talk about the evidence collection issues. Moving on to the evidence collection, there have been several significant questions raised about the police procedures. Were they a little bit complacent, a little bit, I hate to say it, cowboy-ish in the way that they dealt with the scene? Especially considering the light fragments found at the scene. Were they collected and handled properly? Proper forensic procedures are critical in ensuring that the evidence we rely on is accurate and uncontaminated. If these procedures were not followed, it casts doubt on the findings and opens up the possibility of an accidental interpretation. In analysing the police procedures conducted on the morning of the incident, it is evident that several police procedures and protocols were not adhered to, raising serious questions about the integrity of the investigation itself. Notably, blood samples were reported collected using plastic cups from a neighbour, who also just happened to be a police officer. This method deviates significantly from standard forensic procedures, which require sterile, properly labelled containers to ensure the integrity of evidence. Additionally, the use of a leaf blower on fresh snow surrounding the body is highly unconventional and likely compromised the scene. This action, combined with the failure to secure the area for several hours, left the scene exposed and vulnerable to contamination. The delay in safeguarding the scene until the state police arrives created a significant gap, during which crucial evidence could have been altered or lost. While there is no direct evidence to suggest that tampering occurred during this period, the failure to protect the scene introduces reasonable doubt regarding the authenticity and reliability of the collected evidence. Moreover, there appears to have been a degree of complacency among the initial responders, possibly underestimating the magnitude of the case. This complacency is further underscored by several procedural lapses, including modifications and inaccuracies in official documents. The defendant's SUV, a critical piece of evidence, was taken for examination with unexplained time gaps, and they were quite significant, and this was in the documentation, which could indicate potential contamination or tampering opportunities. In such a high-profile case, it is imperative that every step of the investigation process adheres strictly to established protocols. The shortcomings in this investigation highlight a failure to follow the letter of the law meticulously, thereby casting a shadow over the entire process. The implications of these procedural flaws are profound, as they open the door to reasonable doubt and undermine the credibility of the findings. It is essential that these issues are thoroughly examined to ensure justice is served and to restore public confidence in the investigation and its process. Now, there's been a lot of discussion and talk about a cover-up, and of course, the layers involved and the moving parts required to be able to pull that off for any length of time is pretty significant. We're also forgetting the victim's status and his own influence, right? So JohnOKeefe was not just the victim, he was also a well-respected police officer. Orchestrating a cover-up of murder would be extraordinarily difficult, and it would involve numerous people across various levels of law enforcement and the judicial system, and it seems slim that you would be able to pull it off for any length of time anyway. We must also consider the possibility that the Alberts, fearing the consequences of their involvement, might have made a series of poor decisions to cover up their actions. This does not necessarily point to murder, but rather a desperate attempt to avoid suspicion. Such an extensive cover-up to manipulate so many people across different levels of law enforcement and the judiciary would nearly be impossible without someone eventually speaking out. This leads us to consider that while there may be elements suggesting a cover-up, it could be more about covering up involvement in an accident rather than a deliberate homicide. Despite leaning towards the accident theory, we can't ignore elements that suggest a cover-up. The missing calls and deleted messages indicate an attempt to obscure the truth. Conflicting statements from key witnesses and mishandled evidence further complicate the picture. These actions could be seen as an effort to hide involvement in an accident rather than conceal a murder, adding another layer of complexity to this case. If we explore the middle ground, so what if the Alberts and others involved feel a sense of guilt or fear repercussions, and leading them to hide their involvement? They might not have committed a murder, but their actions to cover up an accident make them look, or at least appear, more guilty. Ironically, this scenario fits with Karen's frantic questions and strange coincidences. It's possible that a series of poor decisions have painted a picture of guilt that isn't entirely accurate. If we have a few concluding thoughts on that, as we scrutinize every piece of evidence and testimony, it's essential to remain objective and consider all possibilities. The jury's role in deciphering these details will be very crucial. This case exemplifies the thin line between accident and intentional actions. We must rely on a thorough examination of the facts to uncover the truth. In hindsight, it may have been more prudent for the prosecution to pursue the initial charge of manslaughter rather than murder. At this juncture, despite the gravity of the accusations, the case presents a myriad of gaps and inconsistencies that could potentially sow seeds of reasonable doubt among the jury. While the prosecution sought to present a compelling narrative, presence of these uncertainties creates a palpable sense of ambiguity. As observers, we are left eagerly awaiting the emergence of a proverbial smoking gun, or the discovery of that elusive piece of evidence that will intricately weave together the elements of this case. The significance of expert testimony cannot be overstated. It remains a cornerstone upon which the outcome of this trial hinges. In the face of these uncertainties, the decision to pivot back to the initial charge of manslaughter may have afforded the prosecution a more defensible position, one grounded in the acknowledgement of the complexities inherent in this case. Nonetheless, as the trial unfolds, it's imperative to maintain a vigilant eye on the evolving narrative and the emergence of any new evidence that may ultimately tip the scales of justice. I'm Lulu Bell. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate the support. If you haven't already, like and subscribe. Welcome to the community as we try our very best to find the answers and find justice in this case.